Korean cinema has had an increasing growth in popularity in American culture since the turn of the century. From the cross-cultural phenomenon of Chan-wook's Oldboy in 2003 to Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, capturing the most prestigious mainstream cinematic prize in the Western world, the Best Picture Oscar at the 2020 Academy Awards, to the Squid Games phenomena conquering Netflix, Korean cinema has staked an important role in modern global storytelling and has captured the minds, hearts, and attentions of millions of American cinema and TV goers, an audience for the long-held and well-known aversion to subtitles in foreign entertainment. And it seems, as it so often does, that when one starts to connect the threads of the phenomena, it is not sporadic or accidental, but rather can be boiled down to one man. And that man, of course, is Steven Spielberg. It is only natural that any story discussing Korean cinema begin with Steven Spielberg. Spielberg was born in 1946 while Korean cinema was freed on August 15, 1945, their independence day from Japan. Up until this point, Japan had been using the cinema of South Korea to spread Japanese propaganda. Following their independence, military dictatorships and years of civil war ensured that many themes in Korean cinema were restricted by authorities.
Subjects like communism, obscenity, or topics that could harm the country's image were also censored.
In turn, South Korean filmmakers often focused their attention to the always popular Western cinema, creating films that resembled Hollywood fare to one extent or another. Then, in 1993, Steven Spielberg, nearly as old as the post-war Korean cinema, went and changed the game up. During the same year in which he publicly took no money for his work on Schindler's List, calling it blood money, he also made Jurassic Park, for which he would ultimately earn over $250 million. I wonder if he ever needed that forfeited Schindler's List money. Jurassic Park was a monster global success, thrilling audiences on not only initial, but also upon repeat viewings. A founding South Korean government, in the midst of turnover and turmoil for which we will discuss, couldn't help but notice that film, more than being an art form and artistic expression, was an economy and avenue of commerce into and of itself. Kim Il-sung, the 7th president of South Korea, saw a report that the export revenue alone of Jurassic Park matched the foreign sales of Hyundai cars for that year. Kim acted quickly, fast to move on what he saw the economic potential of the cinema was. And it is at this moment when Korean motion picture companies began to operate as giant corporations, and thus rose to Hallyu, otherwise known as the Korean Wave.
Jurassic Park.
Not too long after Jurassic Park redefined the economic possibilities of cinema exhibition, the so-called International Monetary Fund crisis in the Republic of Korea occurred, the most impactful crisis in the history of Korea. Cinema would become a vital site for the nation to investigate its post-colonial political crisis. The film industry in Korea has always been a focus of the government and has historically been regarded as an extension of its industrial policy. It is no surprise, as Korea fell prey to the US government's open market focus because of the crisis, that the cinema of Korea would approach a kinship with Hollywood. From the 1990s onward, Korea's economy faced similar post-industrial struggles that had beset Western economies in the 1970s, a period in American cinema which exploded with grit and cynicism and characters enacting personal vengeance and revenge against a people and system that had left them behind. A similar cinematic movement resulted in Korean cinema, and the familiarity would sit well with Western audiences who'd grown up on Dirty Harry and the French Connection.
It's me.
Much like the 70s in America, in which Coppola, Lucas, Scorsese, and, again, Spielberg, professed lovers of cinema and voracious viewers, were able to enter the filmmaking realm due to the breakdown of the old Hollywood system, this period in the transition of cinema from national to corporate actually allowed an influx of new Korean filmmaking talent. There was Park Chan-wook, a film critic and cult film enthusiast, or Bong Joon-ho, a well-documented cinephile. And then even Kim Ji-woon, who, after slacking around, took himself to Europe because there were theaters there where he could watch films all day. 2002's Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, released 5 years after the IMF crisis, appropriately as a preoccupation with economics, while it spins its tale of revenge. Revenge and economics will appear again and again in Korean cinema of this period. Much like the gritty 70s thrillers in America, where individuals would take aim at the system and scorch the earth in the process, Korea, now in an economic shift and turmoil of their own, would produce a cinema that rises to their moment, which felt familiar to Western audiences that were raised on similar cinema a generation before. These films analyze a country shifted by the post-authoritarian period that extended to the early 2000s, a period of uncertainty and transformation. Notice how this period itself is handled in many of the films of this era. Two of its masterpieces, 2003's Memories of Murder and Oldboy, deal with inciting incidents that occurred during this period, while the film's story itself elides it entirely. In this period, the Korean economy faced the same post-industrial struggles that the Western economies encountered in the 1970s. It is a cinema in which it can be hard to point fingers, because history is so murky. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance and the other two entries of Park Chan-wook's so-called Vengeance trilogy, of which the second, Oldboy, was one of Korea's breakout hits worldwide, are not pure revenge thrillers of righting wrongs and the ones who have wronged you. It often is not that simple. Revenge rises from interactions between individuals and grows beyond into systemic relationships, more far-reaching and intense, and harder to satisfy and complete to any sense of reason. Revenge is no longer personal. Often it is a result of bureaucratic greed. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance begins then, not with any great betrayal of violence or lust, but instead in the act of corporate downsizing. Now, let's for a moment investigate the evolving situation at the time between the governments and economies of the US and Korea. On December 3, 1997, the IMF approved a $57 billion bailout package, the largest in Korean history, with the intent to stabilize the Korean economy after the credit crisis of 1997. The won, their national currency, was massively devalued and there was an abundance of short-term debt. This moment so happened to align with what is called the end of the American century, meaning the end of the cycle of hegemonic accumulation for America, which commenced in 1941 as the United States headed towards joining World War II, an area of war where there isn't a profit. But as a post-Vietnam America entered the 70s, the U.S. empire was hit with a crisis as increasing cost and declining productivity led manufacturers to ship their operations abroad. Likewise, in Korea in the 1990s, labor costs rose and developing nations provided competition, leading to the end of favorable developmental conditions. This shift led policymakers away from industrial policy towards a market-based orientation. When the bailout was accepted, the Korean economy was forever reshaped. As a condition of the bailout, Korean assets were made to be more available to Western capital under pressure from Washington. For years, there had been protectionist shielding against such. Korea became more entwined in the American economy, which itself was branching out into inevitable globalization. It is eerily akin to the Western world, only delayed by decades. Whereas Americans had to unravel Watergate and governmental corruption for the first time on a grand scale, the Koreans would now have to face their very fallible leaders. Several former presidents have been charged with corruption, beginning with Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo in 1996, later pardoned. Ron Moo-hyun had associates and family charged with bribery. He committed suicide in 2009. Lee Myung-bak was charged with bribery, embezzlement, and tax evasion in 2018, whilst Korean courts sent to prison the first woman president, Park Ji-hee, for 24 years due to corruption and abuse of power. Unsurprisingly then, scholar Lindsay Hallam notes that the resultant cinema indicates a lack of trust in systems of power, something that had been growing ever since the beginning of the fall of the American empire, and has now begun to loom large over the Korean population after the IMF crisis. Hallam notes that while Koreans themselves suffered under austerity, the chaebol became richer.
They're all chaebols, which are large South Korean conglomerates that are usually run by one single family with total assets that exceed 5 trillion won. There are more than 80 chaebols in South Korea in 2023, and the revenue of the 10 biggest accounted for almost 60% of South Korea's GDP in 2021.
The IMF allowing the introduction of policies that placed profits well above people and supported corruption within the government. These chaebol famously operated in a patriarchal model in which salarymen were promised lifetime employment. But then, of course, the IMF crisis, where the IMF put harsh austerity measures into place which resulted in labor cuts, and with these layoffs a noticeable spike in the suicide rates. Which brings us back to the corporate layoffs of sympathy for Mr. Vengeance and more broadly to the salaryman of Korea, a once trusted and reliable position. Society was beginning to see the job loss and layoffs of salarymen during a turbulent, transitory period in Korea where nothing is safe. In 2001's Take Care of My Cat, The film focuses on 5 characters whose actions seem to make them active participants in functions that help to make their own labor obsolete. Cellular technology in this instance. Another thing about Korea and America in general, attitude is an important indicator in cinema. One need only look at the post-war cinema of Akira Kurosawa to get an indication of how the Japanese felt about the American presence in a post-war Japan. Likewise, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is flush with an anti-American sentiment. Ryu's girlfriend personifies this, passing around political flyers with slogans denouncing the US military, thus linking the period of the film and its tensions to the American military presence, as well as the economic phenomena. She is involved in the Revolutionary Anarchist Alliance, which shows up at the tail end of the film, and without too heavy a spoiler, sheds a new light on the crimes that preceded, shifting the context of the crimes as a capitalist and away from moral failings. 2003's Memories of Murder starts with the bones of the Hollywood crime thriller, and then morphs and plays with it to fit better in a Korean context, personifying convention before jettisoning it midway. It is interesting to note that this flick arrived at a moment when Hollywood filmmaking itself was morphing conventional forms into their own new form. Pulp Fiction, Usual Suspects, Mulholland Drive. Interestingly, Memories doesn't play up the trauma of the events it explores, nor the genre points that it accumulates, but rather seems to function as a work of nostalgia, remembering a time before, a time when the world seemed a different place. As Joseph Jung-Hoo-jeon says in his book Vicious Circuits, which is a primary source for this essay, the nostalgia of Memories of Murder is a nostalgia not for murder itself, not for a return to violence or even for a time and place, but for the kind of attention that murder demands. This cinema harkens back to the simple times of the 1970s gritty American thriller, where there is somebody to point the gun at to exact one's revenge, fused with the adrenaline of modern cinema, arriving at a precarious turning point in American cinema and worldview. After 2001, specifically in early September, the American mentality and psyche would shift greatly. We had been attacked domestically, much in a way that the average American never fathomed prior. Perhaps the vigilantism of Popeye Doyle seemed quaint now to us too, and perhaps we longed for such simple vices. While we were forsaking our freedoms for what we were told was our protection, Memories of Murder hit us with an examination of police brutality, and with what greater exemplar than the amputation of policeman Chow, who winds up needing his foot amputated after a history of kicking and brawling with it. Police brutality is a thread that moves throughout the tale, as is the moves of a serial killer who acts in the rain. And there is something reassuring in the fact that the people do not accept the rampant power of the police as a necessary evil to catching the killer, something the American public was, and make no mistake about it, still is, being told might be a necessary evil for the protection of their country. Note also how this film leads the pack in a rising movement in cinema, especially in America, the unsolved crime. Can we imagine a killer not only being unavenged, but undiscovered at the end of our cinema to this point? But as the world grows and greed expands, the consumer became much more familiar in wading into the waters of the unresolved. Not only are the killer's identities elusive, but they have also become increasingly a part of the system, and therefore the personal identity is less important. In Memories of Murder, the killer is concealed while the victims grow numerous. Park Chan-wook's Oldboy also explicitly calls out the IMF crisis, using it as a historical background. Oldboy follows the mysterious incarceration and then release of a weary company man. His incarceration occurs during the period of the IMF crisis. Like Memories of Murder before it, which completely neglects the period, Oldboy deals with the crisis by omitting it. The concept of massive job reduction and the layoffs of salarymen was a result of the IMF crisis and governmental transition that the public was adjusting to. Stateside, a generation of workers were learning that the period of 30 years and a gold watch was also over. The worker was expected to adapt and transition to several careers in his time. The company as extended family in both countries was something of the past tense. The company cares about the bottom line, not you, and will excise you if feasible and helpful to the bottom line. So much for stability and company pride. Salarymen, long a staple of the Korean economy, were commonly called upon to work long shifts, sacrificing their personal lives for the nation. An interesting twist in Oldboy is that the long hours and dedication somebody like Dae-soo learned to hone during his tenure with his company, he can now devote to turning himself into a Korean Liam Neeson bent on revenge. The salaryman, like the average working American, truly has no voice. They work to survive, to protect their family. How cutting, then, that the ultimate hit against Dae-soo, spoiler alert here, is that he was manipulated to sleep with his daughter Midu, and in order to protect his daughter from this truth, Woo-jin insists he cut out his tongue, therefore silencing him for good and all. As Joseph Jung-ho-jeon states, It is not enough for Daisu to debase himself. He must also comply with the discourse of the shy ball, one that revises the past both to control the salarymen and to absolve the Hojang of guilt. The rich and powerful control the story, thereby controlling history. They can rewrite it to play the way they desire. Those underneath them have no voice to protest. Their tongues have been cut. Much like salarymen, so too go gangsters. When the government is set up as legalized thuggery, the mob must evolve too. Nature changed irrevocably for all following the IMF crisis. Like salarymen, the gangster became disposable. That a Western audience would go for mobsters and guns is no mean stretch of the imagination, but why these films seem to resonate deeper than most disposable fare being released concurrently stateside again resides in Korea's confronting its recent past, present, and future, and how it mirrors America's own. These films seem also to suggest that the difference between corporate transaction and illegal transgression may be ambiguous. These films frustrate in how legal and moral bleeds into the illegal and immoral, and the line between gangster and government confuses. Regardless of what side of the political aisle you are stateside, you can probably relate to this feeling. And while the gangster revenge angle played stateside, to Korean audiences, as film scholar Jin Hee-choi notes, the films appeal to local audiences for their exemplifications of cultural anxieties over the rigidity of social hierarchy. Critic Daniel Martin notes the gangster films tended to be intimate and insular, and that stories of underlings and enforcers in the world of organized crime reflected, to a much higher degree, the actual state of Korean society. And go figure, this too is a strong correlation to the IMF crisis, as Korea saw traditional businesses expand into the terrain of organized crime, no more so than in loan sharking or legal debt borrowing at a high interest rate. High interest credit card lending became common in the years following the crisis, when government agencies deregulated the industry to stimulate consumer spending. Money lending was once a large book of business for organized crime, except instead of taking your leg if you don't pay, they could do damage much worse now, illegally. Like American millennials, the youth of Korea were quickly being denied access to middle-class lives that previous generations of Koreans had been able to enjoy, even for those who had gone to university. A film such as A Bittersweet Life is all of these things, an evocation of a fading industry, a cynical tale of misplaced loyalty, and a rollicking action picture. What wouldn't an American audience love about it? Further westernizing A Bittersweet Life, director Kim designed it as a neo-noir that would emulate Melville's Le Samurai. Melville himself, a Frenchman whose cinema loved Hollywood. Think about the thematic similarities in A Bittersweet Life as well as Oldboy. In Oldboy, Ju's son is locked up and released years later to commence his revenge. In A Bittersweet Life, Kim Sun-woo is buried and left for dead. Both, basically, are killed and reborn. Once reborn, they seem dead set on simply setting the record straight. It is a rebirth in which the last stage seems to be annihilating everything before that caused it. One thing Americans do love is a big monster. Who doesn't? Koreans do too. Let's now look at Bong Joon-ho's 2006 The Host, a giant-sized, ready-made monster movie spectacular that also, yes, you guessed it, deals with similar themes: economics, betrayal, the IMF crisis, American involvement in foreign affairs, allowing it to engage the Western viewer while also challenging them more than, say, King Kong vs. Godzilla. The Host foregrounds itself in relation to U.S. hegemony in Korea, offering an allegory of U.S.-Korean relations at this post-IMF crisis moment, in all its late capitalist, late empire and strained partnership glory, exposing, or at least clearly explicating, the unbalanced power dynamic of U.S.-Korea relations. Which is interesting, because what perhaps is being presented as troubling to the Korean audiences might allow for a comfortability that allows the film to draw in an American audience, namely that the film is a story of a monster that is a product of the American military by their negligence. So while we, the American audience, might settle in for the familiar monster and U.S. military mechanisms, perhaps the Koreans see the asymmetric power dynamics and force the U.S.'s over Korean sovereignty since the Republic's formation in 1948. It likely doesn't hurt that aesthetically the monster was designed in San Francisco by a now defunct but then busy effects company. While the American military are responsible for the creation of the creature, it is their misuse and abuse in handling the situation that is an even far worse cry, causing much more destruction with the handling of the situation they themselves created. Even sicker than this, the Host posits that the Korean experience post-IMF crisis also shoulders some of the blame, at least for the size of the problem. A businessman in the film jumps off a bridge to his own death early in the film. This alludes to IMF suicides, which were a real problem after the crisis, since the monster, unwittingly unleashed by American incompetence, swims in the river and feeds off of flesh, since director Bong indicates that suicides in the Han River occurred nearly every day, the greed of the Republic is responsible for the creature's ever-growing size. While the host delighted Western audiences with its well-thought-out critique and implications, Korean cinema, no homogeneous beast here, was not above a film like D-War, which climaxes with a dragon atop the U.S. Bank in downtown LA. So far, we have talked about Korean films that have struck a chord with American audiences that, while influenced by American culture and cinema, have been Korean creations. But then there are also films such as 2003's Tube, a remake of 1974's American film The Taking of Pelham 123, itself remade, as the Hollywood Machine does, by Tony Scott in 2009. In 2003, the subway systems in Seoul, then controlled by 3 state-owned agencies that work together, the real-life Seoul Metropolitan Rapid Transit Corps featured in Tube, were under discussion at the time to be privatized. Allegory and meaning aside, Tube plays not just the hits of Pelham, but also cashes in on the moments and tropes from numerous Hollywood flicks. Not that a viewer has any need to look too deeply. These flicks, The Good, the Bad, the Weird, The Chaser, The Tale of Two Sisters, etc., are fun. And American cinema, like American government, has wielded such oversized power for so long, it is no wonder these films are influenced as such. But a little backgrounding in history might help to explain why Korean cinema, from the time your buddy first told you about Oldboy and you went to see it, just hits different. Which perhaps means we take our cinema with a bit of despair, a whole lot of conspiracy, and a dash of resignation. And whereas we at least used to be hopeful for the brutal revenge in cinema that is denied morally and legally in life, we now are resigned to not even know who to point the barrel at, because it is an overarching system. We are within it, and it does not serve us. We, most Americans, can understand that, and that is why, when we watch post-IMF crisis Korean cinema, it is like it understands us. Hey Tonglers, thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more exclusive Tongal content. And if you're a creator, be sure to visit the Tongal website at tongal.com for some exciting opportunities.